everybody, welcome back to another episode from the DJ Anesh series. It's been a good run, guys, this year, despite all that's been happening. Thank you for your encouragement and support all this time. Hope that you have learned so much from the DJ Anesh series of podcasts. Unfortunately, our radio show is going to end soon. The syllabus is ending soon. You guys are either clapping right now or smiling right now, jumping around a bit in joy, or what is more likely is that you are crying, you are so sad, you are calling for encore, I want more. Unfortunately, your journey is about to reach a stage where your syllabus ends and your revision will begin. So, pretty sure we'll have fun with that as well. We have one last topic to go through though, the Asian financial crisis. This is the second topic in Theme 2. And I think that it is quite fitting that we are going through this topic right now, given what's going on in the world today. As they always say with us historians and with history, things tend to repeat themselves. Not exactly, but we go through similar things. Many of the things that you see over here in the Asian financial crisis of 1997, you either already see now or you will be seeing soon this year. So you guys will have your own stories to tell as well. Hopefully everyone is sheltered and just away from the storm and the fallout effects won't be that bad this time round, but we'll see how things go. Speaking of crises and speaking of hiccups in the economy, I do have to forewarn you that with this podcast, there will be some PTSD coughing, or not PTSD, oh my god, how can I say that? It's ASMR coughing that you guys love but haven't heard for in a while. Drank quite a bit of coffee today, seeing that I would have a lot of explanations to do for the AFC, to mentally prep myself and give myself that energy, that enthusiastic voice that you all love, going through this very technical topic. So hopefully it'll make things easier for everybody, and yeah, I don't want to do too much talk sing song for the intro this time round because I suspect that this podcast might go on for a bit longer than usual. So kind of like we'll see how it goes. I will try to include some videos if I can, and I will let you have access to them as well. So that's the first ASMR call for you. Some coffee reflux there. Good morning, everybody. I hope you are all doing well. Let's go into the content for today. Now in class, I just want you all to do a bit of a recap. In tutorials this week, what we did was we had an overview idea of what the AFC was like. Remember, we played that simulation game all about speculation. I want you to keep those learnings in mind, the things that you heard in class, because they are relevant to what actually historically did happen in Southeast Asia in the lead up to 97 and in 97 itself. So a lot of the learnings, a lot of the personal experience that you went through during your tutorials, there are going to be connections to what we are going to go through today. Just like what I mentioned in the tutorials, right now we are going to be covering the structural causes of the AFC. Remember now, our main focus is on the causes of the AFC. So we are looking to understand why and how the AFC happened. We are looking and identifying the various factors involved in this. And more importantly, because of causation and significance, we are going to be weighing the factors against one another to determine causes, their relative importance to one another. So as we normally do in a causes kind of essay focus or causes kind of topic, we will look at the different factors, different causes, each in themselves, but we will also seek to want to weigh them against one another in an evaluative importance kind of way. So keep in mind that's what we'll be doing eventually as well. For today, what I want to do is go through two structural causes with you, and in subsequent lessons we'll go through the other factors. But these two structural causes are pretty massive in themselves. Quite a number of concepts for you to unpack over here, so we'll go through them slowly. I will try to slow down my speed, or you guys can actually have that YouTube function of slowing down speed or whatever, so it's really up to you. Yeah, so without further ado, let's go into the topic itself. Right now, remember, as we go into the structural causes, just want you all to recap and recall what the term structural means. So when we use the word structural causes, or when we use the word structural, usually it implies and it is associated with two things. The first thing, as I mentioned in class, there's a time factor, there is a time element to structural causes. So usually these causes or these factors, in this case these weaknesses or these problems, have been going on for quite some time. And I dated it as far back as the 1980s. So even going about 1.5 decades before the crisis, we can start to see some of these problems, these cracks in the system, starting to emerge. It's kind of like if you think about it with politics. When we studied Southeast Asia, we saw that in the 80s and the 90s, there were many pro-democratic movements that were starting to rise up against the authoritarian regimes. Now, all those things didn't happen overnight, right? The sense of democracy or the understanding and the call for it, it all took place like decades before. And then finally it built up and built up and built up until you have what you have in the 1980s with the pro-democracy movements. Same concept over here. You're looking at a build-up of economic weaknesses across decades, or 1.5 decades, and then leading up to the events of July 97 itself. So that's the first element to do with structure. The second element in association that has to do with structural causes is the idea of extensiveness. Usually when you say something is structural, or usually when you say that this is a structural cause, you are looking at the factor in itself is quite extensive. Meaning to say that it did impact or it did affect many aspects of the economy or key aspects of the economy. So when we study all these structural causes, actually you're really looking into the pillars of the economy. And unfortunately for Southeast Asia, you're looking at the pillars in the economy having key flaws and key weaknesses being mismanaged. So it's so detrimental because these are the things that are holding the economy together. These are the things that are leading to prosperity. But unfortunately, in this case, the pillars were decaying and they were decaying for quite some time. And then finally, everything was triggered in 97 itself. So with regards to the category of structural causes, that's what the framework looks like, the principles of it looks like. In this slide, you can see the breakdown of specific structural causes. So all of these 5 points that you see over here, it does conform to our idea of what a structural cause is. Looking at the time factor, it's been building up for quite some time, didn't happen overnight. And also looking at how extensive it covered the economy. You can take a quick glance over these 5 factors and you can see, right, that actually with regards to the identified 5 factors over here, it basically covers like major aspects of the economy. And that's why the crisis was so devastating, or why these factors were so devastating leading to the crisis, because well, really, this is the economy in a nutshell. These are the drivers of the economy. These are the engines of the economy. And yet, they were exposed by having key flaws and very weak foundations. So, today, actually, we are only going to go into 2 of the structural causes. And the first one that we are going to look at has to do with production. So, we are looking at our manufacturing sectors. We are looking at our export sectors, and we are trying to see, what's going on over there, what are some of the problems that they face over there. So that's the first one that we're looking at, the export sectors as well as the production sectors, like manufacturing, that kind. So that's the first one we're looking at, a key pillar of the economy, definitely. You all learn about industrialization and all that. Yeah, this is what we're talking about, the problems within the industrial sector. The second second structural factor that we are going to look at today concerns another sector. And the other sector that we are going to look at is what happens in finance. So what's happening in the finance sector? So AFC, the F stands for financial, Asian financial crisis. So quite clearly, it does indicate in the title itself that there is some serious problem with the financial sector that is leading to this entire catastrophe. So that is the second point that we're going to look at today, and you can see that it concerns another key pillar of our society, of the economy and society. Okay, so these are the two things that we're going to look at. Then the rest of it we'll do it in subsequent classes. So we can just focus on these things today. Cool. I have to warn you that I have cutting edge animation for today. Like, you won't believe, like, wow, like, it's visionary, that kind of stuff, Oscar winning. So mentally prepare yourselves for amazing PowerPoint presentation skills. Now, the first one that we are going to talk about, the first structural factor that we have is this factor, again, that concerns our export sectors, our manufacturing sectors, basically the industrial sector that we are really trying to focus on. The factor, I phrase it as unsustainable export growth models. Or if you want to remove the export and you want to make it even broader, it's okay. So you can just say unsustainable growth models. So you may not just be looking at exports, but maybe you might even be looking at domestic production. There are some problems there as well. But we will more, for this factor, we are going to be really focusing on this particular sector. But you notice that with this title, I put a widening current account deficit. Now, the widening current account deficit, we'll get into it later. But I want you to understand that the widening current account deficit was a result of the unsustainable growth models. Okay, it was a result. So the widening current account deficit was an outcome of the unsustainable growth models. But at the same time, this widening current account deficit could also have served as a cause for further consequences. Okay, so there's a dual function to factors leading to the AFC. Some of them are causes, some of them are outcomes, some of them can be both. So later on we'll look at and see how this exactly can be and how you can use it in your essays as well. Okay, so that's the first slide. Now we're going into the detailing of this particular factor itself. Keep in mind that we are writing history essays, so econs is econs, but let's try not to get lost into it. But today I will be going into some economic concepts. Do you need to fully explain these economic concepts in your paragraphs? No, you don't. Okay, just need to give a brief general understanding. What you should focus on, guys, okay, this is the key. If you are writing stuff down, make sure you get highlighted and all that. This is the key. With every point in a causes essay, okay, in this case AFC, right? With every point that you run, like, the content is important, but what is more important, okay, this is the important part, what is more important is that you explain, okay, write explain in caps, highlight it, bold it, put your blood on it, make sure that it's sealed. Explain the unique contributions of that factor and explain the significance of that factor in leading to the AFC. Tell me, how exactly does this factor contribute to the AFC? And tell me the severity of this factor. How devastating was this in leading to the AFC in itself or in comparison to some of the other factors out there? So one more time, the important part is explaining the unique importance of that factor, the unique contributions, as well as the relative importance, the significance of this factor in relation to the other ones. Okay, so that's the important parts of your paragraphing, not the economic jargon and knowledge and all that. That's going to occupy some part of it, but the focus is still writing a history essay. Okay. Now, going into the points over here, two complementary and sequential factors, like what I mentioned, the CA, current account, okay, I'm just going to use CA from now on. The CA deficit is an outcome of the growth models, the unsustainable growth models. I'll explain that later. But the CA in itself can be used as a factor to prompt further consequences or further impacts that you can assess as well. So this is an example, this point in itself, it is an example of an external sector development that contributed to the crisis. Again, here I scoped it to external sector because I'm really looking at exports and things like that. However, if you want to broaden this point to look at core issues within production, which means to say you can consider both exports and imports. You can consider both exports and domestic production. Then that's up to you as well. It's possible. So, because the same key flaws you can see in both sets of industries. So, here's the first economic kind of explanation that I have for you guys, and it concerns this term that you might be really wondering, like, by now, what's the current account deficit and what is the current account in itself? So here comes cutting edge animation PowerPoint slides. I did a TED talk on it. You can go and check it out about how to use PowerPoint slides effectively through cutting edge animations. So what exactly is the current account? Now, all of you guys know that any country engaged in international trade, like no country is an island, we will import stuff. Like any country will import stuff. So you guys might know this even better than most people because most of our products that we buy online, is like imported from like elsewhere, like Taobao is from China or like Amazon's from US and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of imports that are coming in. That's us as individuals, right? But as a country, as a nation, right, there is a much larger scale of imports that are coming in for the country, its development and its trade and so on and so forth. So there are imports. Usually they come on container ships. 80% of the world's traffic, economic traffic, still is by maritime trade, which is why Singapore is so important. So there's imports over there. Now, conversely, you have the other side of the equation, which is exports. Now, exports, you guys might already be familiar with this. We produce stuff, manufacture goods or agricultural goods or whatever it is. We don't just sell it to the domestic market, but we export it to other countries in order to reap the benefits of having a wider market, having a larger audience. The capitalist enterprise, hoping you get more profits, more revenue streams from this. That's what we do as producers, like individually, but as a nation, once again, the country as a whole does engage in exports, collective exports from the country as a whole, and that is going to be their revenue stream, that is going to be the source of their profits as well. Now, again, amazing animation. What happens when the amount of imports exceeds the amount of exports? This is where you have a current account deficit, when a country imports more than it exports. Now, why is it called a deficit? Because you are paying more than you are receiving. To import, you need to pay. There's a cost to it. So that is the payment, that's the cost. For exports, you are kind of selling your goods to other people and you're receiving money. But if a situation when they tally all the accounts and the volume of imports exceed the volume of exports, that means to say that your costs are exceeding your revenue. That's where you start to run into a current account deficit. Now, important for you to note, is a current account deficit necessarily a bad thing? No, it might not be. In fact, it might also be an indicator for the good health of an economy because it shows that the country, to some degree, is able to spend and is able to consume, which is why there's so much imports coming in compared to the amount of exports going out. It may not be that the exports is low. It just means that the volume of imports coming in, the amount of things you're paying for is just exceeding that of exports. So, important for you to note, this is the situation. Is it necessarily a bad thing in itself? Maybe not. But over time, if you continually register current account deficits, right, if you don't ever go into surplus, then there will be questions that are going to be raised about your country's economy and the sustainability about it. When we played the game, the key learning there was about speculation. Investors look into these kinds of indicators in order to determine for themselves how healthy an economy is. Based on these trends and these indicators, they are going to be making decisions on their investments, their money, their capital. So as I said, this in itself might not be a problem, but if it's on a prolonged basis, it might lead to certain questions. Now, the other scenario that could happen is just the flip version of this, which is that you are exporting more than you are importing. And so in this case, you would call it a current account surplus, when a country exports more than it imports. Now, if I'm to relate this to Southeast Asia and the trends of what it was like leading up to the crisis itself, Singapore and Indonesia, actually their CA was running a surplus. As for Singapore, I think it was all the way, Indonesia up to a certain point. So, healthy signs and all that. For the rest of the countries, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, they had a trend of deficits. So that is the relation to Southeast Asia and what kind of trends there were out there with regards to the CA. Now, you might want to ask the question as to why did this situation arise? What was wrong with the production models of the country and the economy, and why was it increasingly reaping less and less positive outcomes? Now, so the key question here, what accounts for the unsustainable export growth? Now, the first major reason has to do with protectionist measures. Now, protectionist measures is when a government, usually it's a government, they artificially protect certain industries to allow them to grow, to allow them to develop themselves. Protectionist measures are useful, especially when you have infant industries and you want to protect them against larger foreign competition. Okay, so governments can institute certain legislation, certain licenses, certain tax holidays that would ease the cost of setting up that industry or that company. Now, this is useful in a particular context when you're growing, and things like that. But if you keep protectionist measures for a long period of time, especially after these industries have reached a certain maturity stage, it might cause certain problems because protectionist measures means that you're under some form of government guarantee or you're under some form of a buffer. This can potentially lead to complacency. There's no incentive for you to continue to innovate because you're always under that sense of protection and that security. So this happened in Southeast Asia, especially in places like Thailand, Indonesia, where protectionist measures continued to stay in key sectors like industry and to the detriment of the economy, because over here it bred complacency, and it led to more inefficient production structures. Now, what is the consequence of inefficient production structures? There are three consequences that I can think of. The first one is about speed. It takes relatively slower for you to produce your goods. You're not up to date with technology, and so maybe you have like some outdated kind of machinery and so on and so forth. So it takes a longer time. Maybe at one point in time, this was the fastest shit on earth, but at this point in time, you have not kept up with times, and therefore like there's some problem with the speed of your production. The second problem has to do with the quality, right? The quality of your goods, it may drop. Again, has a lot to do with technology as well. You don't innovate, you don't continue to innovate, there's no incentive for you to innovate, so your quality of your product will remain stagnant. It will always be at a certain kind of like standard. The third thing has to do with quantity. How much can you produce? And if you don't keep up to date with technology, the latest methods and so on and so forth, there's no incentive to research and innovate your methods and your approaches, then you're always going to remain stagnant. You can't produce beyond a certain capacity. So three things: speed, quantity, quality. Taken together, these things, when they start to see a downward trend, it does affect income. Because your goods are less attractive, you're only selling at a certain limit, and you don't go beyond that. So maybe across time, the demand for your goods will fall because it's just not attractive anymore compared to other products that are out there in other countries and so on and so forth. So this hurts the company, but this hurts the nation as well because collectively, income is falling. Your revenue is falling. People are buying less from you. People are demanding less from your country. So this hurts national income. So the falling, you can see over here, the widening current account deficit, falling demand for exports, the falling demand for your country's products. And the added problem of that there are larger competitors out there. At that point in time, it was India and China. So people are shifting their gaze from your country to somewhere else. Even if there weren't these other larger players out there, people demand your product less and less because it's just a shitty product and it costs a lot. Like, why would I pay so much for a shitty product? So, that's the kind of mentality that people have. The main consequence here, once again, is on income, is on falling incomes, both on the company level, both on the sector level, as well as the national level. Now, at this point in time, as exports, the demand for your country's export, as they are falling, ironically enough, this was a boom period in Southeast Asia. Remember I said that sometimes the economy is so scary because you don't know what the hell is going on. You think it's a good time, you think it's happy days. But actually, the cracks are starting to appear already. At this point in time, as the cracks in your export sectors are starting to appear, as the cracks in the industrial sectors are starting to appear, what happened is that Southeast Asia is still enjoying a period of prosperity, which means that people still have the ability to spend, and they're spending and they're spending and they're spending. They're importing. Nations as a whole, they're importing a lot as well. So draw a chart for yourself. Exports are falling, imports are rising, or imports are still maintaining at a certain level. And that's how you get your current account deficit. So, inefficient production structures, again, cutting edge animation, look at that. The weight of the boxes as they fall onto the slide gives you an artistic performance art interpretation of how important this factor is. Inefficient production structures. So you lose your price competitiveness. Again, it just simply means that your products are less attractive and your products are costing more and more. Falling demand, naturally, no one wants to buy a shitty product for a high price. And let's say if imports are growing or if it's remaining status quo, that status quo, this term over here, ceteris paribus, that's what it means. Just means that things remain as they are with the imports. Then that's where you have widening CA deficit. Woo! Silence. So that's the entire chain of how you get a CA deficit, and the word widening there suggests that the negative trends are continuing year upon year, and not only are they continuing, but in some cases the CA deficit is getting larger and larger. Again, speculation. If you are an investor looking into the country that you are investing your money in and you see such trends and such indicators coming out, how would you feel? How will you respond? Are you going to have that same sense of confidence as you did when you put in your investment? Or are you going to lose that confidence year upon year? What are you going to do with your money? And if you think like that, the million of other investors, they think like that, oh, there's some shit that's going to happen down the road. So, Again, going into what I said was the most important part of your paragraphing and your point development is going into the unique contributions as well as the relative importance and significance of that essay. So over here, the unique contributions you can see is the two like bolded things over there. The main consequences here are the weakened health of the economy, right, as seen by my key indicators, especially national income, or I can even look to falling income from the manufacturing sector or falling income from the export sectors. Not everything has to be GDP, GDP, GDP. You can zoom it down to the sectors itself as well. You can bring up the CA deficit numbers as well and things like that. Okay, so there are many different statistical indicators you can bring in to show the weakened health of the economy. Now, besides the weakened health of the economy, there is an external financial vulnerability as well. Okay, so there is another second consequence, which is that it exposes your economy even more to the fluctuations of the global trade cycles, and it makes your economy less defensible. Makes your economy less defensible if an external shock happens to you. Now, what is this external financial vulnerability that I talked about? It comes in two ways and it corresponds to the next 2 points over there. So the continued trend of CA deficits are prime indicators to suggest there are deficiencies in the economy. As I said, when an investor sees the CA deficits continuing plus widening, I'm thinking they're going to be a bit cautious and a bit spooked by that. This would fuel speculative activity. That means to say the first financial vulnerability that you have over here is the potentiality of investors pulling their investments and their money out of the country because of this particular thing. And if your economy is heavily reliant on FDIs, such as this, then your economy is really on weak foundations. Once they pull out, the entire system will unravel. So that's the first financial vulnerability that you have. And it is external because it concerns investors from all across the world. The second financial vulnerability that you have is that as the nation or as companies increasingly register deficits, in order to continue production, in order to continue their business, and in order to continue the nation and its economy and all that kind of stuff, they may engage in more borrowing, which Southeast Asian governments and banks and companies actually did. They engaged in more foreign borrowing. Now, this foreign borrowing would increase the financial vulnerability as well because you're getting more locked up. You're getting more linked to external actors. And there is definitely that vulnerability there because you're exposing your economy with these kind of linkages. Normally, in a normal scenario, it's okay. Like this is how the economy grows, right? You borrow and use it to spend and so on and so forth. But what happens when you can't repay the sum that you borrow? Or what happens when the foreign lenders are calling for their money back immediately? Now that's where the problem all starts to come in, because if your production sectors are not doing well, you probably don't have the ability to repay. Then what happens then? Like you got no money to pay back the people it's like loan shark loan shark lend you money and then like charge you interest and shit, and then you're like, oh my god, like I don't have money now, and someone got interest to pay you back, and oh I'm sorry man. What would the loan shark do? Right? He'll probably like come knocking at your door and stuff like that. So okay, why not let's take a brain break here. There was this once when I was staying in my old house. One day we went downstairs at HDB, so we went downstairs to the car park, and then my mom's car was like poured over with red paint, like paint wall paint, that kind of shit. And the whole car was just like splashed with red paint. And then on there was this note from an Along from a loan shark and said that, hey, owe money, pay money, that kind of shit. Wow, legit, man. And then my mom was like, what? Okay, what? Like, what, bro? Like, I mean, no, it's not me. And then we read the note, and the note had this like some messages lah. And then like there's this car plate number, and this car plate number was totally different from ours, and we just figured that it was a case of mistaken identity. If I can, I'll dig up that photo and show you guys. Well, it was a highlight of my day that day to see my mom just freaking out. Just like how people in the Asian financial crisis freaked out when they saw the economic indicators that were coming out of Southeast Asia. Wow, what an amazing segue over there. Back to our slides. Going on to the next slide. So the sequence of the activity that I showed you in the previous slides, you can see them here on the left side. Going on to the right side boxes you see over here. So when your export earnings decrease, as I said, you are earning less and less. Your revenue is getting less and less. People don't want to buy your products and so on and so forth. Government earnings also decrease, and there's falling national income. So collectively as a whole, it's not just the companies that are facing the problems, but the nation as a whole, the government as a whole, would be facing those problems as well. So the long-term current account deficit build-up, as I said, continuing trends. It might also impact the currency as well. The currency of the country will depreciate, which means that it starts to lose value due to the investor confidence issues. Now, what does it mean over here? As I said, there are many trickle-down effects. When investors look into a country and they don't have that sense of confidence, they may not just be pulling out their investments, they may not just be pulling out their capital and all that. They might actually be also selling the currency that they are holding for that country. So let's say, for instance, country X. So country X, I see that their production cycles are quite shit, and it's no longer profitable for me to continue to invest with them. So what do? I dismantle all my investments in the country. I pack up and leave, take out my money and so on and so forth. I have some currency of country X, but I foresee that this is not going to be profitable for me anymore, so I'm going to sell the currency back to the foreign exchange. I don't want to hold on to that currency anymore. I want to hold on to the currency of country A rather than country X. So the more of the currency of country X there is out there in the foreign exchange, that the less value it has. It's a very simple rule of demand and supply. The more supply that you have of something, chances are the less value that it has. So when you have something rare, that means to say the supply of it is low, chances are the price for it will be quite high. But if it's something that's commonplace, there's a lot of it in the market, chances are the value of it will be quite low. So that's how economics works, demand and supply. So in this case, the second another trickle-down effect that you might have is that there might be attacks on the currency as well, where people start to sell the currency, and that might weaken the value of it on an overall setting. So when the currency value weakens, when a currency depreciates, or when a currency devalues, actually that serves as another indicator to investors that this country might not be doing too well. So when you see currency depreciating on a large scale, on a sustainable basis, when you see a government devaluing their currency, this not only has economic consequences, but it usually is a political statement as well, meaning to say that the government needs to make some adjustments in order to try to shore up the economy, because the economy is not doing well at that particular point in time. Again, another signal to investors, again, something that could fuel further speculation. So when a country's currency, the gray box that you see over here, when a country's currency depreciates, that means to say that the currency has lost value or has lower value now. Another effect is that the existing debts that the country has with foreign actors is more expensive to pay, because now you need more of the same currency to repay the same sum of money, because your currency has lost value. So you need more of it to repay the existing amount of debt that you have. And this, I mean, you can clearly see this is problematic because now you got to find like more currency and more money to repay the same amount of money that you owe. And there could be problems with this, and governments could run into more debt, or they could request for an extension of the repayment, or the worst case scenario, they can't pay back. It becomes what we call a non-performing loan, or you can even go bankrupt as a country. So you can see just from such a core problem in the economy leading to one of the indicators actually can lead to so much residual effects and impacts on the economy as a whole, which is why I call this a structural factor. It is so extensive in its cause, but it's also so extensive in its impact across the economy, across key indicators of economic performance. So that's how you can think of this factor in greater detail. Now, on that currency matter that we just talked about, there are some countries which peg their currency to another more powerful or more stable currency out there. Usually the pegging will be done to the USD, but you have other countries that peg, like Singapore and Brunei, we peg our currencies towards one another. So in some places in Singapore, especially with like the older generation population, you give them Bruneian notes, they will actually accept it because it's a 1-for-1 ratio with the Singapore dollar. In the case of Southeast Asia back then, there were a number of economies that pegged their currency to the USD, Thailand, Philippines as well. And I want to bring up this point over here because when you peg your currency to a more stable currency, actually it's meant to give stability to your currency because you're pegging it to a stronger, more stable economy. Hopefully you can ride on that, and that gives your currency some measure of stability. But I think that is also, this pegging, right, can also be quite deceptive. So as it was in Southeast Asia back then, the currency figures for Thailand was actually quite stable given that they were pegged to the USD. And so when you look at an indicator like that, you kind of assume that there's nothing really wrong with the economy, there are no major flaws, everything is going okay, and so on and so forth. So it betrays the real situation, the core issues that are happening to their key pillars of the economy underlying the surface. And that's why it was a very slow build-up. And when it erupted, it really erupted on such a magnified level because of the structural nature of all these problems. It just built up over time and it just exploded in that sense. A pegging of the currency exchange between two countries, it can disguise the problem. It can make it look like the crisis was a sudden thing that happened. But actually when you analyze it, you can see that the problems are pretty deep-seated when it comes to that. So the last table that I have over here for this particular factor on the growth models has to do with the CA deficit, and I just want to pick it out. These are from the notes. I just wanted to pick it out from the notes to show you guys that when you there are going to be a lot of numbers when you read the notes, right? And you don't need to remember everything. Like what you do is that you just pick out key numbers or you just pick out trends. So let's say you see here for Thailand, you can see the current account deficit is negative upon negative per year upon year. It gets worse like from 1994, 1995, and it kind of hovers around there like 1995, 1996, it's negative range that kind of stuff. So either you just pick up some stats from 1990 to 1996. So you pick up one stat in 1990, you pick up one stat in 1996, then you draw that trend of continuing like deficit. You don't need to remember like all the numbers over here. You can just try to pick out certain numbers that are important to your point and then use it in that way. Again, my caution is that don't try to remember all the numbers as well. It's impossible, even for RVNs. You guys have like big brains and stuff like that, right? But wow, even for RVNs, no way, man. You can't remember all the stats. So be strategic in what kind of stats you want to what kind of stats you want to use. Make it meaningful to the point that you're trying to argue. Okay. Now, before I move on to the next factor, which is on the financial sector, what I want to point you guys towards is that along with the podcast and this set of slides that I have for you guys, with this point on the unsustainable growth models, I have I've given you guys also a document, a paragraph of how this point looks like in an essay setting lah. So basically, I wrote out a paragraph for this for this point, and I want you all to see lah what seems to be my priority when I write this paragraph. How do I use the stats and the evidence? So just to give you a reference point as to how an AFC factor paragraph looks like on this point. Then you can apply it to your other paragraphs when the time comes as well. So alongside with the set of slides, you will get that as well in the drive. So at this point, maybe you can pause and take a break. A lot of information and so on, I get it. And maybe before you come back to the next factor, you can take a look at that particular document and just read it for yourself, see the structures, see the priority, see the explanations, and then you come back to the podcast. Okay, so welcome back. If you guys have taken a break, welcome back. We are going to be talking about the next point right now, next structural factor as well, looking at the financial sector. As I mentioned, AFC, right? AFC, the F stands for financial, so naturally you would think that the core issues are going to be with the finance sector that led to this crisis and led to the magnitude of this crisis. So we don't just want to say, we don't just want to see how it happened, but we also want to understand why it was so severe. The C in AFC stands for crisis. So there is definitely the element of severity over there that we want to account for and to explain with our factors as well. Remember, it's AFC, not KFC. KFC stands for Kentucky Fried Chicken. KFC, 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 not AFC. AFC, not KFC. AFC, not KFC. KFC, not AFC. Okay? I bet you tonight, some of you all will be ordering KFC because of the inception that I put into your brain right now with KFC. By the way, this podcast is sponsored by KFC. Now, going into our financial sector weaknesses, remember just now the sector that we were looking at was more or less the production one, the industrial, manufacturing, export. Now we're looking at the financial sector. Over here, I have kind of like 3 points about the financial sector weaknesses, and they all kind of collectively come together to produce the problems and the crisis itself. You notice that with each of the points over here that I have underlined some words in each of the points here that I have. Why did I underline it is because these underlined words are quite crucial in your presentation of the problems. Because if I remove these underlined words, actually these things sound quite positive. Let me explain. Going into the orange circle that you see over here, if I remove excessive and I just present the point as financial deregulation and liberalization, opening economies up to one another, fostering independence and international trade, all these things sound good, right? Then why is it a problem, right? So you must add the word excessive over there. The second one, the yellow one, weak regulation and supervision of finance and banking sectors, uncontrolled liberalization. Again, if I just bracket it as liberalization, actually it's not a bad thing, in fact, it's the spur of economic growth for many economies, right? The deregulation of the financial sector. But here we are looking at the uncontrolled liberalization of the financial sector. So that's another key point that you have over there. The third one, the red one, over-dependence and foreign exposure. Again, it's a good thing to form relationships with foreign partners, with economic arrangements and all that kind of stuff. It's a good thing. But when there's an over-dependence, when you have weak and narrow foundations for your economy, if you are not innovative enough, if you're not up to date with the times, things are going to be quite difficult for you because you are now dependent upon other actors for the stability of your economy. So therefore, I hope you can see why these terms are important in your presentation of financial sector weaknesses, because we are really looking at certain actions that were taken to the extreme. And so you should present your points like that. Okay, so going into the detailed explanations of these interrelated points with regard to financial sector weaknesses, again, we are looking at consequences, and there is a lot of financial vulnerability and exposure of the economy that these factors and these weaknesses will provide and in leading up to the crisis. The last 3 points that you can see over here has a more explanation of what each of these points entail. Financial deregulation is when the government relaxes its controls and gives more power to the private sector to make its own sense of decisions, and it's not really going to be subjected to government intervention in a direct manner. The government will still play some role, but a lot of power and autonomy is given to the private actors to manage their own affairs. So a lot of power is given to the banks in order to manage their own affairs and to engage in their own methods that will reap the most revenue and profit. So there's weak government supervision in that sense, and especially when it's uncontrolled or when it's heavily unsupervised, I think this can lead to like a lot of problems, especially when you have the capitalist kind of enterprise where everything is driven to be, like it's profit driven, and through that singular kind of motive and singular kind of objective, there could be a lot of shady practices that go on, as was the case in Southeast Asia in the finance industries back then. And so there's a lot of foreign exposure. I'll explain what this means with this point over there in the next few slides. Okay, so financial sector weaknesses, it can concern the responsibility. It can concern both the government, the state actors, as well as the private actors, the non-state actors, the financial sector itself. So, as I mentioned, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was increasing capitalistic elements, increasing liberalization of the economies in general, but especially with the financial sector as well. So private actors like the banks, the finance institutions, they are given more and more autonomy, less and less government restrictions in order to manage their own affairs. So again, cutting edge animation right here, applause. Government's role becomes smaller, and then banks, finance institutions, they get larger. And when the banks are given the autonomy to decide, they're really given the autonomy to decide, right? And again, the banks they have an overriding focus and an overriding objective of making as much money as possible. I mean, that's the goal of every capitalist enterprise. Make as much money as possible. Don't tell me that, I'm a capitalist enterprise, but my overriding goal is the welfare and the equity of the people. Don't give me that. I don't think that like anyone would come out and say that, especially not at that point in time. So what usually happens is that the banks, the finance industry, and in general, they will be looking at investment opportunities, and they'll be looking to see where they can make the most money at, where their money can be put in and the rate of return is the best, and so on and so forth. So they're going to be putting it into many different places. Later I'm going to show you. And sometimes these banks, these finance institutions, or these companies in general, they would be borrowing heavy amounts of money in order to finance their investments, in order to finance their purchases. So that's why I use the word there, uncontrolled foreign borrowing by finance and banking sector. Money is coming in, a lot of money is coming in to Southeast Asia for investment opportunities, but at the same time, there is a lot of borrowing going on as well. The problem with this borrowing, and I think one of the key problem features is that all these sums of borrowing are on what we call short-term loans. Generally speaking, short-term loans, there is a maximum repayment period of 3 months. Okay, basically within 3 months, of you borrowing that, you got to return the money. So on a normal basis, if your economy is healthy, there's sustainable practices, things are going on well, transparency and so on and so forth, on a normal basis, these short-term loans are okay. Like people usually can, either repay it or they can refund it. But the problem is that what happens when your economy is not doing well? And with these short-term loans, 3 months period, within that span of time, you can't repay it. Then there is going to be some problems that arise from that. So you can still see that in this case, there is this relationship, and there's this phenomenon of a dependency on foreign lenders, foreign institutions, and therefore there is this external vulnerability that you're exposing Southeast Asian economies to once again. So on top of what we saw in the production cycles over there and the CA deficits, over here we have another layer of vulnerability, another layer of exposure from the finance industry that is further compounding on the problems and the weak foundations of Southeast Asian economies. So let me give you an illustration. As I mentioned, in the 80s, 90s, Southeast Asia is going through a boom period. Many investors, they are looking into Southeast Asia for investment opportunities, and there usually at that point in time was a high rate of return, which is why Southeast Asia was so attractive at that point in time. A lot of money is coming into Southeast Asia. That's what we call rapid credit expansion. And the problem is that even though money is coming in, do you have adequate regulation of the developments that are going on within your economy, or are you just blinded by the money that's coming in and not really managing the growth and the expansion well? So a key problem that I'm going to highlight over here is that the core issue may be down to governance as well, which is managing the growth of economies, regulating, supervising. You can give more power to private actors. I don't think that's an issue. But the problem is that in giving power, do you still have safety mechanisms to supervise, to govern, to regulate these industries, just keeping them up to check and making sure that there aren't any bad practices that are going on that might be detrimental to your economy? I think the problem with Southeast Asia governments is that they really let go and they really cast a blind eye to a lot of the key problems within the finance industry back then. So going into the illustration, short-term loans, right? Now the short-term loans that the banks are borrowing from, they are lending to property developers or they are lending to industrial developers. So there are a lot of money that's going into building residential zones like condos or housing, like housing meaning like bungalows, terrace housing, that kind of stuff. There are a lot of money that's going into building up industrial zones, factories, production lines, and so on and so forth. So a lot of this is correct lah. Actually, it's a normal economic process. You want to expand your economy, so you're doing all these kind of things. But the problem is, what happens if there is so much investment going on, there's so much production going on, that the market, the country's consumption reaches a saturation point. Now, what does a saturation point mean? Basically, it means that these investors or these companies or these developers, they are still developing their houses or the factories or whatever, but it is not taken up. So you can have a condo development and the occupancy rate is 20%, which means to say that 80% of that condo development, no one is staying in them. It's just empty shells, empty houses. Same thing in industry. You can build industrial zones, factories, warehouses, production lines, but it is not active. The occupancy rate is also at a low rate. So what is the consequence of this? For the investors, for the banks and the finance institutions, there is no or very little return of their investment, what we call low yield of their investment. They're not getting back the kind of money that they're lending out, or it may take really a very long period of time for them to recover these spending in a sense. So when you have that no return of investment, it kind of traps everyone and it kind of like stops everyone in their state, and it presents a very particularly problematic scenario where no one can return money to anyone. So the developers and all that stuff, because they're not getting back money, they have no revenue stream, or they're increasingly, or rather decreasing revenue streams, and they have no ability to repay the banks, the domestic banks that are lending them the money. Then the domestic banks, actually they borrow from foreign banks, and because the domestic banks are not receiving the money, they cannot return the foreign banks the money. Oh, emotional. So this breaks the entire like stability of the cycle, because now there's a lot of defaulting of the loans. People are just not being able to pay up in time, and things like that. And when people default on the loans, whether it's the companies defaulting or whether it is the banks defaulting, is what we call the build-up of the non-performing loans, or the NPLs for short. So when you default on a loan, you register an NPL, right? A non-performing loan. The problem comes in once again with investors and speculation. This is another key indicator of the economy, especially from the finance industry, of non-performing loans being a sign of a weakness or a decay of the strength of that economy. So once again, it is a key economic indicator that fuels speculation, especially if it is in a large quantity, especially if it is going on for a large period of time. Together with the other key indicators that are falling, all these things will collectively build up to really hurt investor confidence. So that's something that is very worrying for any government or any country, to see these kind of signs that are coming out. And of course, they will be thinking, well, this is definitely going to hurt the confidence in our economy. When speculators believe, or investors believe, that the economy is not doing well or is not going to do well, they are going to be spooked. They're going to lose their confidence. They're going to pull out their money. That's what we call capital flight. Capital flight just basically means that the investor or the group of investors or whoever has lost confidence in their economy. They are pulling out their investments. They are taking out their money. They are selling the currency. Collectively also fueling the further damage to the economy. So this is the very scary and very damaging thing about speculation, which is that it is based on certain indicators, right? It is based on certain indicators that are coming out of the economy. But because of speculation, because of the actions based on speculation, they themselves, the speculators, the investors, they themselves are also going to be fueling the crisis. The speculators, the investors, they themselves are also going to be contributing to the damage to the economy. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, or it's a cyclical thing where everything is happening concurrently at once in a cycle, and this boulder is just going downhill, and finally it's just going to crash something. You might ask yourself, why does this situation allow to persist? Like, why is there uncontrolled regulation of the finance industry? Why is there weak supervision by the governments and the state actors and things like that? The first thing has to do with the governments themselves. Lack of political will in government regulation of the finance and banking sector. Everything in the 80s and the 90s were going well for them. So of course they would think that their current practices are good, and there's a sense of complacency that bred in. And the idea, or the current idea at that point in time is, yeah, let's give power to the private sector and let them do their thing, and so they did, right? But was it on a sustainable basis? Perhaps not. And the governments weren't quick enough to identify and to rectify the problems over there. So the first thing has to do with a lack of political will. But I think this lack of political will has to be complemented by another key feature of most Southeast Asian economies, which is the degree of governmental corruption. Governmental corruption and cronyism, I will save it for another factor in itself in a later lesson. But for now, you can kind of like just get an understanding that many of these key institutions in finance, whether it's banks, whether it's finance companies, they have government links. I'm not saying that they are under the government, but they have personal links to the leaders in power. And the leaders have a vested interest to shield these companies that are close to them, these finance banks that are close to them, and to protect them in some way. So the same thing, it might breed some level of complacency as well from the banks because they are under government protection and basically can do whatever they want. They are given that assurance that whatever they do, it doesn't matter because even if they run into trouble, they will be bailed out by the government. So a lot of the bad and corrupt practices kept going on and on and on. As I mentioned to you before, one of the key distinctive features about the AFC was that degree of state-level corruption that perpetuated this crisis. The degree and extensiveness of corruptive activities between the political and the economic elites. Huge distinctive factor about the AFC. So this continued to build up financial sector vulnerability. Over here, I have a more explanation as to what crony capitalism and corruption is, particularly seen in Indonesia, Thailand, to some degree, Malaysia as well. I just want to highlight the last point over there. As I mentioned, this point I'll talk about in another factor. But the last point over there is that governments continually have to draw on their income or their reserves in order to save and in order to continue to boost these bad performing finance institutions. And of course, this definitely hurts the health of the economy, the strength of the economy, especially if they have to keep doing these kind of things where they're using taxpayers' money in order to, shore up these institutions. There are two other things that I just want to end off with. The first thing has to do with monetary policy. So monetary policy basically is when the central bank, they set interest rates of the country in order to either expand or to contract the economy. So you don't have to know too much about it, but basically it's the adjustment of interest rates in order to achieve certain economic objectives, either to expand or to contract the economy. Again, don't have to go too much into the economic detail of that, but basically in Southeast Asia back then, the interest rates were quite high. And the interest rates were high because they wanted to attract foreign investors into Southeast Asia. They wanted to give them better rates of return. So the interest rates were set quite high. The problem is that for domestic borrowers, for domestic companies or for just domestic firms who want to borrow, they would also have to subscribe to these high interest rates. So it's costly for them to borrow from domestic banks. So what would usually happen is that these firms and these companies, they will look elsewhere. And if there are other banks out there, foreign banks out there that are giving better rates, lower interest rates, then they would go there and borrow the money. But you can see just now the cycle, right? You borrow foreign money on a short-term loan, and if you can't repay, then it kind of like cripples your economy, and it definitely cripples the firm as well. So it continues to add to the layer of vulnerability that you see over there, even stemming from an issue to do with monetary policy. And the last, I think it's the last point that I have over here, has to do with the fixed exchange rate system, which I actually talked about earlier on, that how it can be a disguise and how it can really shield the real issues and the problems that you see over there. The added point that I have over here is that since everyone believes that the currency is stable or that the economy is stable, they will continue on their bad practices, continuing to borrow more, continuing to put in more in investment, continue to build more residential units, continue to build more factories, and so the whole cycle continues to build up and build up and build up. That's what we call a property bubble, or what we call an asset bubble. It just continues to build up until one fine day it's going to pop and everything is going to unravel. So, a really long podcast today, but thank you for staying with me. We've covered 2 points today. Both of them have to do with structural factors. Both of them, to a good degree, has to do with the external sector as well, and that kind of vulnerability and a weakness to the economy that it does contribute all the way to 97 itself. So we'll deal with these two first. I just need you all to consolidate and to see if you have any clarifications or questions that you have for me with regards to these two factors. We'll deal with them in tutorials next week. And then next week, I will also go on to the other structural factors that we have. Cool? Okay, thanks guys. We should go now. Goodbye. DJ Anesh out.